In this episode, we are going to discuss the challenges that emerged against the liberal nationalism that early Congress represented. You know that this Congress brand of liberalism derived much of its sustenance from a very creative engagement with the West. West remained a very important reference point for their political visions. The new challenge that this Congress culture, if you may use this term, began to encounter was a sort of cultural nationalism that intellectuals or politicians unhappy with the Congress's failure to mobilize people to build bridges with the larger society began to create. Against this Congress culture, different labels have been used by historians to categorize these phenomena. Some people have used the term extremism. Some people have linked this extremism with a certain kind of cultural revivalism, which sought to infuse a little more of strength into nationalism by invoking cultural symbols from India's own tradition rather than depending entirely on Western liberalism for the national reconstruction, for political reform. Some people use the term militant nationalism. The nationalists who were not great admirers of the moderates or the liberal nationalism, who used to fashion themselves as militant nationalists. So there are many different levels that have been used by historians to understand the kind of challenge that some of the critiques of what they described as the mendicancy of the early Congress, which is basically an attempt to petition the government and expect the government to offer them a reform package. So we are not going to be bogged down by these labels alone. These labels often do not explain the manner in which the challenge had emerged. In order to understand the development of this kind of an alternative vision of nationalism capable of creating a movement that would actually question the political strategy of the moderates, we have to look a little more closely at the politics of the 1890s, when the Congress was losing its appeal. The popular response to the Congress seemed very enthusiastic in the 1880s. So it is in this context, people became critical of the way the early leaders of the Congress had adopted their strategy. Even Tagore was not very happy with the way this kind of mendicancy was practiced by the Congress leaders. During this period, we find a certain impact of what we have labeled as revivalism on Tagore's mind. There was a phase when Tagore was influenced to some extent perhaps by the political use of certain cultural symbols, also wrote that famous poem called Shivaji Utsav. R.C. Dutt, for example, who was a liberal congressman, a president of the Congress, a civil service official, who also wrote novels like Maharashtra Jivan Prabhat or Rajput Jivan or Shandha, in which he was harking back to the martial valor of the Hindus in a situation when the British had this habit of consigning the Indians to a position of martial inferiority, describing them often as effeminate people, as in people incapable of military valor. So it was important for many such people like R.C. Dutt or Bankim Chandra's novels, in which you have similar kinds of evocations about Rajput valor, in an attempt to see among the Rajputs the reincarnation of the Kshatriya valor of the past. This is also a kind of revivalism. But R.C. Dutt, as you know, was a liberal congressman. So it is not as if that the liberal congressmen who were otherwise very happy with their own strategy of pursuing moderation in politics or waiting for the government to offer them the reform were not affected by revivalism. So revivalism alone doesn't explain how militant nationalism emerged as a very powerful movement, deriving its strength from revivalist ideals, but at the same time recasting these revivalist ideas in order to suit their political strategy. There is some point or some strength in the argument that the use of Hindu cultural symbol as political resource, which the early Congress leaders wished to avoid, and which the critics of the early Congress leaders were very anxious to adopt in order to create a more powerful movement, in order to build bridges with the larger society, had derived their ideas or their concepts, their visions from revivalism. So it is important, therefore, to make a distinction between the intellectual dimensions of revivalism and the political use of these revivalist ideas.
Sir, how does one make the distinction between this intellectual dimension of revivalism and its political use?
Let us take, for example, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Bankim Chandra Chatterjee made Krishna the great hero. A man who, according to Bankim Chandra Chatterjee's Krishna Charitra, had been able to unify the entire country. Anandamot, for example, another very important novel in which this kind of nationalism was very clearly stated, although with some amount of caution, used the goddess as the symbol. Now you can keep on arguing on how the goddess cult, which was so important in Bengal, had been one of the very important ideological dimensions in extremist nationalism later. In revolutionary terrorism, many of these extremists and terrorists actually looked upon the goddess as the inspiration. Now, the image of the motherland as the goddess, you would come across in Rabindranath's famous painting Bharat Mata. So there was certainly an attempt to imagine the motherland as the goddess, and certainly it had a Hindu imagery which many of the nationalists had begun to use, whether it was Krishna as the great unifier of ancient India, or the mother goddess which was demanding sacrifice from his worshippers. So sacrifice at the altar of the mother goddess and sacrificing one's life for the freedom of the motherland became two sides of the same coin. To the extent that the image of the motherland had a certain kind of resemblance with the image of the mother goddess, to the extent that the British image of India's disunity could be counteracted, could be questioned by reference to the grand unity that had been achieved in the epic age by Krishna, fade into nationalism, you can see the connection very clearly. But as I said already, the politicians or those who were critics of the mendicants policy of the early congressmen, those who wished to be powerful within the Congress by posing the challenge against the existing leadership, made use of these symbols in their own ways. For example, Aurobindo Ghosh. You can see the transformation in Aurobindo Ghosh very clearly. Aurobindo Ghosh started as a radical. So he was thinking of a kind of a revolutionary upsurge in India following the French model. But then there was a stage when Aurobindo also came under the spell of this kind of nationalism which was revivalist or which was using cultural symbols derived from Indian tradition. Aurobindo Ghosh wrote the famous tract Bhavani Mandir in 1905, in which the main message was that the freedom fighters were expected to sacrifice their lives just in the same way that the goddess also demanded sacrifice. So, there is always a selective use. For example, Vivekananda. Vivekananda's Vartaman Bharat. Vivekananda had remained a great inspiration for many of the militant nationalists. but not all of his ideals were actually adopted by the political leaders. Political leaders made use of their ideas. Those who were trying to question and challenge the Congress leadership also made use of other kinds of ideas.
Sir, was there any popular dimension of such kind of militant nationalism?
Yes, this is a very important question, and in fact, the discussion that we were actually holding anticipates this question. That if you look at the popular dimension of this militant nationalism, it is not necessary that you will simply see in them a mere reflection of all these revivalist ideas. I have already noted that R.C. Dutt, who wrote on the Rajputs and the Marathas, was a liberal congressman. So it is not as if that revivalism was affecting only those who were the challengers of the Congress leadership, who were challenging the kind of nationalism that Congress represented. So when you look at the popular dimension of this nationalism, and you can see the distinction very prominently, because the militant nationalism, or the kind of Hindu cultural symbolism that we come across in this militant nationalism, was not hesitant or was not actually reluctant to make use of obscurantism as well. Take, for example, a man like Shashadhar Tarka-Chudamani in Bengal. Shashadhar Tarka-Chudamani was the famous editor of a journal called Bangavashi. Bangavashi constantly wrote critical articles about the Brahmos, about Surendranath Banerjee, about the liberals, often going to the extent of describing them as denationalized people, but at the same time emphasizing the value of orthodoxy. And this is not a very new kind of conflict that you come across suddenly in the early part of the 1890s. You see them also in the 1880s, when the Bengal provincial politics was divided into two distinct groups. One was the Brahmo group, which was liberally inclined, and the other was more orthodox group. Say, Amrita Bajar Patrika group was the main protagonist of this orthodoxy. So a time would arrive in the early 1890s when these forces of orthodoxy would actually try to combine, deriving strength from some of these ideas that intellectual revivalism had produced. They could actually blend the ideas from intellectual revivalism suitably with many obscurantist ideas as well. And this kind of conflict came to the surface in 1891 during the age of constant agitation. And Shashadhar Tarka-Chudamani in Calcutta was one of those who continuously wrote editorials and pieces against this kind of a measure that the government has introduced by way of raising the marriageable age of women. The reformers had supported this measure wholeheartedly. For Tarka-Chudamani, it was an unwelcome, unjustified, illegitimate intervention in Indian customs by a foreign ruler. This is where you can see the distinction. When we talk about liberalism of the sort that Banerjee or Gokhale represented, it was reformism, certainly. But this reformism also had significant social dimension, where political reformism was finely blended with a vision of a modern, enlightened, reformist Indian society, where some amount of equality would be established between men and women, there would be less religious orthodoxy, there would be more openness. Against it, you have a kind of political radicalism. That radicalism was questioning the legitimacy of the kind of moderate strategy that the Congress leaders of the early stage had adopted. But at the same time, there was an element of social conservatism as well, acting as an important resource in this kind of militant nationalism. And this social conservatism was not necessarily following the ideas of the great intellectuals who were thinking of science in ancient India, thinking of democracy in ancient India, thinking of the great Indian tradition capable of enriching our modern visions as well. Some of these men were also very orthodox to the point of being obscurantists. And Torko Chudamani is just one example who believed that whatever was there in the tradition was acceptable and therefore not to be tampered with. Alien state didn't have the right to make any intervention in those matters of social life. So age of consent, I think, would provided a very important turning point in what we see as a militant mobilization. It had a social dimension as well. Historians have written about the manner in which the most successful lawyers on the High Court of Calcutta were more liberally inclined, were more aligned with the Brahmo group. The less successful people among the Bhadralok or the educated classes who were clerks in the offices were more receptive to orthodox ideas. And it was to their orthodox sensibilities that Torko Chudamani's Bangavashi actually tried to appeal.
Sir, did such things happen in other parts of India as well?
Of course, I mean, it was not just a Bengal affair. Even though among intellectual revivalists you would come across a large number of Bengali intellectuals. But take, for example, Maharashtra. Maharashtra had already emerged as an important province where an ongoing conflict was going on between the forces of reform and forces of orthodoxy. Deccan Education Society, in which both the reformers and the more orthodox elements were present, was an educational endeavor, but soon within the Deccan Education Society a conflict had emerged between protagonists of women's education who were more liberally inclined, who had been followers of the famous Marathi reformer Chiplonkar, who thought of extending institutional education to women, and against them was ranged a group led by Bal Gangadhar Tilak, the great patriot as he was, but at the same time he actually had very conservative social visions. He thought that women's best place was in the household. So whatever education that women deserved must be tuned with their primary role in the household. So there had already been a major controversy in the Deccan Education Society over women's education during the 1880s. Age of consent, just like in Bengal, provided a new occasion for these two groups to run against one another. Tilak, in fact, was a great critique of this attempt by the British state, the colonial state, to intervene in social customs. He defended infant marriage, and in the process he was critical of the manner in which reformers like R.G. Bhandarkar, a historian who was a revivalist to some extent in the sense that he wished to revive some of the old ideas in order to strengthen modernism, modern visions. So Bhandarkar had suggested that there is no reason for us to believe that child marriage was an integral component of tradition, because our tradition as we find them in text says something very different. Tilak wouldn't actually go along with this idea by suggesting that whatever has been inherited by us from a long history must become protected from the kind of illegitimate intervention by the colonial state. Tilak's main intention was to use this as a resource for undertaking a more broad-based mobilization in Pune in order to pose his challenge against the Pune Sarvajanik Sabha leadership, the reformist leadership, which had by then become very influential in the Congress. Gokhale was one of his main adversaries, but Gokhale actually represented a group which had clustered around Vishnu Chiplonkar, who published the journal called Sudarak, in which the cause of social reform was espoused. And Gokhale, as you know, was a moderate. I mean, he didn't believe in this kind of a militant onslaught against colonialism. Tilak was a critic of that strategy. Tilak was more inclined towards making use of this kind of intellectual resource in order to generate a very powerful movement. Initially in Pune, but then he expected that the impact of this movement would spread far and wide, would inspire and motivate people from other regions as well. So Tilak would soon actually organize Ganapati Utsav in order to rally people around him. A group of followers certainly emerged. And then Shivaji Utsav, using the famous historical symbol of Shivaji, not merely as a great military leader of Maharashtra, but also as one who had enough strength and courage to resist Mughal imperialism. So there is a communal dimension emerging from this kind of use of Hindu cultural symbols. But the point is that such symbols, such images had become very important in the kind of popular mobilization that the critics of the Congress mendicancy had adopted. You see the ramifications elsewhere as well. For example, cow protection. If Tilak was using Ganapati or Shivaji as symbols through which he would be able to rally support, he would be able to create a more popular base for nationalism. Similar was the impact of another very important symbol like cow. Cow as a deity, cow as an object of worship, and the sacrifice of cow.
So, in what ways did cow protection become such an important issue?
Yes. You can see the ramification of the cow protection movement all over India. But it acquired much greater intensity in northern India. And it had something to do with the activities of the Arya Samaj. Once again, we return to the old question of a certain distinction between the revivalism that was represented by intellectuals or those who thought of reinvigorating Indian culture by harking back to the more creative aspects of ancient Hindu culture, and the use of such symbols by others for generating a more powerful political movement. The Arya Samaj, as you know, had been founded by Dayananda Saraswati, who was a Gujarati Brahmin from Kathiawar, but whose main spheres of activity were in North India and Punjab. It was in North India that cow protectionism became a very live issue. Arya Samaj initially was primarily a kind of religious reform movement. Reformers like Dayananda wished to purge Hindu society of many of the medieval accretions, the corruptions that had entered into the pristine Aryan Vedic religion, wished to go back to the pristine Aryan Vedic religion by adopting the rituals of the ancient Aryas. So fire sacrifice would become very important for the Aryas. At the same time, Dayananda also wrote about cow as a very important resource which deserved to be protected. But soon, this kind of invocation for protection of cow as an economic resource certainly became a very live political issue as well. You have to understand this contextually at different levels. After Dayananda Saraswati's death in 1883, the Arya Samaj itself became divided. Some were moderate Aryas who were more interested in the educational enterprises, who were interested in Arya Dharam, reform of the Hindu religious practice by adopting rituals from Vedic religion. But there were others who were more interested in undertaking a kind of Shuddhi movement, basically proselytization. In Hinduism, there is no scope for proselytization, but then they suggested that there was an obligation on the part of the Aryas to create appropriate organizations or sangatans through which a purification movement would be undertaken among those who had been converted to other religions in the meanwhile. So bring them back into the fold of the Hindus. This strategy was adopted by the militant Aryas in the larger context of a feeling that the Hindus were a declining nation. This had something to do with an impression that was created by the census that the number of Hindus was declining, but that had a different kind of context. There is no point in getting into that. But there was a feeling that the Hindus were a declining people, and it was in this context strengthening the Hindus required use of certain symbols which would act as a kind of a rallying point for Hindus to coalesce, to come together. But then cow protection also would become a very important method through which some of the lower classes of the society would try to achieve mobility in the Hindu hierarchy by adopting rituals of the higher castes. So it was very usual to come across people of the intermediary caste adopting these rituals in order to become integrated into the Hindu ritual hierarchy. Now, if you have such social dimensions, you can see how cow protection would become a very important resource for people in the municipal elections. Maclean has written about the manner in which cow protection societies, which had some connections with nationalist leadership in the towns of northern India, became important resource in political mobilization in the elections for the municipalities. So such symbols did not remain mere cultural symbols. Such symbols were capable of being used for political mobilization as they had been done during the 1890s more extensively, to win elections in the localities, to win elections in the municipalities, to undertake a far more popular mobilization around these religious symbols. So cow was not the only symbol. You have Hindi, for example. You have Hindi Pracharani Sabhas, etc., which worked almost in close association with cow protection societies, and in such outfits you would certainly come across some local nationalist leaders who had his connection with the Congress as well. So the Hindi movement, for example, which had been initiated around the middle of the 19th century by a great Hindi poet called Bharatendu Harishchandra, was insistent on the use of the Devabhasa as the language of the state. And it gave an opportunity for the British to play Hindi against Urdu, and thereby creating a long-term discord in Indian politics. Cow protection as an important administrative measure in the municipalities was actually posing a threat to the distinct cultural identity of the Muslims.
So, what was the long-term impact of this cultural nationalism?
This is what exactly I was trying to suggest, that use of such symbols would eventually lead to great disasters. And it is with this note we actually try to wind up this discussion, where we see the emergence of a challenge against the Congress. The use of these revivalist ideas at the popular level had the ability to sow the seeds of discord, which would ultimately lead to major communal conflicts.